Welcome, everybody. It's great to see you. And I want to give a warm welcome here to everybody who will be watching this as part of the Mennonite Church USA convention and other people who may be watching this in the future. It's my honor to be here today with James Krabill, Jonathan Larson, and Thomas Oduro, who are editors of a forthcoming book about a more than 60-year relationship in mission between North American Mennonites and African initiated or African independent churches. We're really excited to have this time together. A lot of people tuning in will not know what African initiated churches exactly refers to. So I thought we'd get started with that big question. Who are the AICs? That's the acronym for African independent churches. Maybe I'll start with Thomas, since you are a member of an African independent church.
I define the AICs as congregations and all denominations planted, led, administered, supported, propagated, motivated, and funded by Africans for the purpose of proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ and worshiping the triune God in the context and worldview of Africa and Africans. The AICs initially may have seemed to be founded for Africans, but as they grow, we notice that no, they are not founded for Africans only.
They're part of the universal body of Christ.
Correct, yeah.
I think it's Andrew Walls who answers this question for a Western audience by saying that the AICs are the Anabaptists of Africa, which itself is a little patronizing as a definition. And maybe that could be corrected by adding how AICs define and view Mennonites. So when I would travel with AIC leaders in Southern Africa, where I was not known, they would introduce me to people as the African independent churches from across the water. It's interesting this way it mirrors back and forth between the two groups.
Africa is a big place, and it is important that we are speaking out of specific contexts. We represent Ghana, Ivory Coast, Southern Africa, and some of these are thousands of miles apart. And so how we've experienced AICs or how we describe them is shaped also by our own experience. We had the rather unique experience in Ivory Coast to be invited to work among a group of people that were founded by an African prophet evangelist before there were really any substantial Western missions present. So these were not breakoffs or reactions to Western Christianity. These were actually local ethnic groups evangelized by an African evangelist and prophet, where people were being introduced to Christian faith for the first time. That's pretty exceptional. That's not the usual AIC experience. Most AICs grew out of some kind of a reaction to Western forms of Christianity that they were experiencing. And it could have been anything from dress to marriage practices to understanding the scriptures in terms of the spirit world. I mean, there were many, many, many reasons, including colonialism, where people in leadership of African churches were forbidden or kept from filling in their proper roles in leadership and held back by Western missionaries who were trying to keep the control.
So fleshing out this definition even further, kind of a companion question is, what is the significance of the AICs to the history of Christianity in Africa or to the nature of the Christian faith in general?
I see them as reformers of African Christianity. When I read what the church in Africa was like before the emergence of the AICs, and I consider what the Christianity is like in Africa, 21st century, I see them as big-time reformers, even though they did not have a leader like the Western Reformation. They, in their smallest way, has reformed Christianity to make it more meaningful and more relevant to Africans and Christianity. Another interesting thing is that even the churches from which they broke away from have inculcated most of the reformed attitudes to their churches. And so now Christianity in Africa has taken a different shape altogether, talking about liturgy, theology, and many other things. So simply, I regard them as the reformers of Christianity in Africa. And as such, the church has grown because Africans know what Christianity is about. Gone are the days when Christianity was called the white man's religion. Now that phrase is forgotten, and we have taken ownership of Christianity. That is one reason why the church is growing in Africa.
That word independent no longer really gets at the heart of it anymore because of the AICs. African Christianity in general has incorporated so much of what the AICs were on the front lines of doing. What are some examples of things that AICs started to do that the mission-initiated denominations weren't doing that really spoke to African peoples?
Before the emergence of the AICs, the worship style was very, very dull to Africans. You go to church and then the keyboard and the hymn book and prayers are read and all those kind of things. They didn't mean much to Africans, but the AICs came and then reformed the worship style. So now these days, whether AIC or non-AICs, you hear churches beating drums, singing together, praying. The most churches that are very conservative, at times when it comes to offering, they will play drums and they will dance while they give their offering. All those things were begun by the African independent churches.
To think about this in the bigger global sense is how one understands Christianity in its encounter with other religious traditions. There's one way of thinking of it, which is sometimes referred to as adapting Western Christianity or enculturating it, making it culturally adapted. So basically, you start with what you think Christianity should look like, mostly from the West, and then you tweak it. You make it African by maybe introducing a drum or something. But your starting point is some kind of a standard that you think is what Christianity should look like. And then you move it toward other cultures by tweaking it to make it feel culturally adapted. The other way, which is actually the way the church in Ivory Coast was formed, because there was no Christian presence there before, was basically starting with the African cultural and religious practices and worldview and asking the question, what would Christian faith look like growing out of this tradition? So your starting point is actually what is already there, with the belief that God is already present and active in this culture before anyone else arrives. And so then you ask, how would the good news of Jesus respond to the deep aspirations of people in this culture? That produces a very different result, because rather than sort of imposing categories or styles or patterns and tweaking them to hopefully make a fit, you're actually starting with a different question and you get different results. And this isn't just about Africa. Jay Matenga, who is a Maori Christian from the ethnic reality in New Zealand, says that you need to start with the indigenous reality if you want authentic Christian faith to be deeply rooted. And then you ask, what does good news in Christ look like from that starting point? So this has happened around the world, and the dynamic that we're talking about in Africa is true wherever there has been that encounter.
Conversation one day in Botswana, with an independent church believer. This person told me that when they used to attend the churches that were mission established or related somehow and traced back to Europe or America, they had to check their African nature at the door. And he said, effectively, we were all kind of superficial people in those congregations because we had left our true selves back there. And it was this divided nature that also emasculated the church that finally led, I think, to the appearance of independent churches where people could walk in being their full selves into the gospel experience. That's actually a piece of learning that could aptly be brought to church life here in North America. Is there some sense in which, as 21st century Americans or Europeans or whoever it is there some sense in which we have left our true selves somewhere else in order to be present in this congregation or in this community of believers? And to what extent has that emasculated the church because our true selves are not present?
Really quick illustration yet that I've thought about many times. There was a Southern African observer who noted that when the gospel came to Southern Africa, brought by Europeans, they brought the bread of life wrapped in a plastic bag. They fed it to people who swallowed the whole thing. This observer says, but we have learned that the plastic actually causes indigestion. We are interested in the bread of life. We are interested in the message of Jesus, but the plastic bag is not ours. It is the Europeans. So we've learned to take off that wrapping and they can have their plastic bag. The good news for us is Jesus, and we've learned to live into a feast with Jesus on the bread of life, but we've learned how to do that as Africans. Christian faith has not been totally rejected by Africans despite how it arrived. In fact, it has been totally embraced by the African church, but they are in the discerning process of distinguishing between cultural forms coming from somewhere else and their own.
How did Mennonites from North America come to be in relationship with AICs for these last 60 plus years? How did you personally, each one of you, come to be a part of that story?
The answer to your first question, Joe, really varies from region to region, how this came about. To simplify what happened in Southern Africa, and particularly in Botswana, where I spent most of my time, happened when a group of AIC leaders engaged MCC volunteers. At that time, there were only MCC volunteer workers in the country, and asked them, could we have a conversation about the Bible? This raises a much larger issue about oral societies and orality, that independent churches in many cases in Southern Africa did not have ready access to the written materials in the Bible because literacy was weak. And so they were curious about this book and wanted to understand it more deeply. And because Mennonites were not in the business of planting their own churches in Southern Africa, it seemed like a safe place to go to talk to Mennonites, that they might be a kind of partner in this illuminating or elaborating the sacred book. I would quickly add here that in time, there was a concomitant question that arose with Mennonites in their interaction with independent churches that would perhaps be summarized by the matching question from the North American side to AICs. Could we have a conversation about the Holy Spirit? it's a two-sided thing in almost every one of these cases of encounter, what arose from them. Often it was the initiative of AICs to approach Mennonites, but then in time what happened is Mennonites had a question or questions of their own, which they brought to the conversation.
I came to know the Mennonites through the Good News Theological Seminary, which was then known as the Good News Training Institute. It was an institute set up to train leaders and members of the African independent churches. One day I went to church and this American lady came, and when she was allowed to speak, she spoke about the school. And she told us that she had come to look for students. So I raised my hand, and then the following Monday, I was in the school. That woman was Emma Grove, who was then the head of the school. And then I met many AIC leaders and members at the school. A lot of things were taught. We were even challenged to read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And now I'm the principal of that school.
James, maybe you can speak to part of the Mennonite Board of Missions side of the legacy of Mennonite Mission Network. And Jonathan Larson was part of the General Conference side of the legacy through Africa Inter-Mennonite Mission. And in the Southern Africa, we got started there in the mid-70s or early 70s. And on the Mennonite Board of Missions side, James, the origin was 1958, 1959, correct?
Right. I mean, the summary version of that is that there were some Nigerians who actually heard a Mennonite Hour broadcast and were fascinated by what was being preached and contacted Mennonite Board of Missions to get more information. But eventually a couple, Ed and Irene Weaver, were sent to Nigeria to work with this group of churches. And they did. And they discovered there were literally hundreds of these different churches. So they became very committed to Bible teaching or learning in learning groups, but also getting the different AICs together to study the Bible together, and also, as much as possible, building bridges with the historic Western mission churches so that there was conversation going on rather than just being part of one group. The dramatic thing that happened was that the Biafran War broke out. The Weavers and others had to leave. And so they traveled down the West African coast to Dahomey, today Benin, Togo, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Liberia, and met with AIC churches and simply asked them if Mennonites were to come and live with you, not to build Mennonite churches, but to study the Bible together and so on, would you be interested? And so there was this contact, and most of the ministries that ended up developing over time in West Africa grew out of these initial conversations. And eventually Ed and Irene also went to Southern Africa and did some similar research. So it's impossible to tell the story without telling their story because they were part of building the bridges.
They were actually the link between West and Southern Africa for the Mennonites in the sense that AIMM called them as the first sort of resident missionaries among AICs to work with biblical education.
And I should say, in terms of colonial history, they had spent years in India under, the pre-independence era. And they really were interested in not reproducing the colonial pattern of mission, where Western people came in and built big institutions and hospitals and so on. They really wanted to keep it pretty low key, relation directed, sharing scriptures together, learning from each other and so on. In some ways, that has caused some tension over the years, but the idea was to learn from the colonial past and not to reproduce that in their new relationships in West Africa.
Why do you think it was the Mennonites that decided to work with African independent churches or to be bridge builders between the different churches in the regions rather than plant their own denomination?
I was told that it was a policy. It was a good policy for the independent churches because the independent churches had the confidence to study with the Mennonites, knowing that they don't have any intention of establishing their own churches. Let's go along with them. And besides that, the fellowship was also good. They were all nice people, the ones I met, Emma Grove and Ruby Johnson's. We found it difficult not to get closer to them. Yeah, they were not handing us goodies, but they were wanting us to know the scriptures.
Weavers would have said, when we arrived in Nigeria, we discovered hundreds of already existing churches. And the question would be, what would introducing another church actually prove? Wouldn't it be better in the larger scheme of things to get Christians together, church leaders together, to grow in their faith and develop these grassroots churches that are already rooted in African soil, but may be desiring more understanding of the scriptures and relationship to Christ? Can't we have a conversation that would actually strengthen the church more than introducing a church that has our name? Not starting our own church actually frees us to relate to other churches because it's less threatening than if we introduce a Mennonite church. And that certainly has been the case in Ivory Coast and in Benin. At the Benin Bible Institute, the Mennonite workers have not started a Mennonite church there, but over the years have worked with local indigenous churches to create a training institution that has literally trained hundreds of people from now 60 to 70 denominations. And everyone there would say that would not have been possible had the Mennonites come and started their church, because we would have suspicioned their motives. So I think that was part of the attraction of going with what was already there rather than feeling like we were obliged to extend our kingdom.
I would say there really had been painful lessons that had stuck in the mission craw of Mennonite Anabaptist thinkers coming out of the colonial experience. There was no way of escaping those painful things, the insights that came from that. And there was a strong desire for a new departure in the expression of giving ourselves to the world. I heard one mission thinker and executive say about this whole enterprise as the death wish of Mennonite mission, which is actually an amazing way to enter into what lies behind the title of this book, which is called Unless a Grain of Wheat, taken, of course, from Jesus saying, unless a grain of wheat fall in the soil and die, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears great fruit. So I think intellectually and with the guidance of the Holy Spirit, Mennonites were ready when this door stood ajar in Africa with independent churches, ready to seek that new departure and begin in a completely fresh way. So that there was a kind of timing, in the fullness of time. Maybe that's the phrase that catches a bit of how it came to be.
We've mentioned the book itself now, which is a book of testimonies of participants in this mission history that you all have put together. And Jonathan started to go there a little bit with the title of the book. And I wonder whether you all had a favorite anecdote or story from the book that sort of gets at the heart of what it's all about.
It's my own testimony, which I have written in the book. I was then the president of the seminary, just a fresh president. The man who handed over leadership to me was Lutheran. And so I was wondering how I could be able to know the dynamics of leadership and all that. And then by the man's ability, the Mennonites and the Lutherans bought a 10-acre plot of land, which is now the campus of Good News Theological Seminary. And I was surprised that a building team from the Mennonites came They paid everything and they came to lay the foundation of the educational block. I never thought that people would just spend money on an institution which they would gain nothing. They were working, very, very, very joyfully. And that really struck me that, it gave me a different dimension of Christianity or Christian ministry. And since that time, I've begun to look at Mennonites in a very, very positive manner.
When I was traveling with one of the regional leaders of independent churches in Southern Africa, a pastor by the name of Otsile Ditseko, with whom Mennonites had a long-standing relationship, I asked if he would go with me to visit a village that I had come to know in just off the Limpopo River, rocky country, really remote area. This was a village he had never visited, but I wanted the people of this village with whom I'd been in conversation to get to know him as a regional leader. And we were warmly received. A goat was killed. We had a feast. There were all sorts of lavish hospitality that was extended to us. Great joy. People gathered. They were singing and dancing. At the end of the day, then we all were shown to our accommodation. And after a rough day on these rocky roads, we fell fast asleep, both of us, in this thatched home. And in the middle of the night, perhaps 2 a.m., it was quite chilly, I woke up because I was aware that there was some sound out in the darkness. And as I lay there putting together where I actually was and who was with me and what the circumstances were, then I realized what was going on, that across the room from me, my friend, Otsile Ditseko, was whispering in prayer. And as I listened intently to what he was saying, I realized then that he was praying for me, asking, that I would be defended, empowered, that my faith would be deepened. And of course, this was a rare experience to be eavesdropping on someone in such earnest prayer for you. And as I have thought about this unforgettable moment, I imagine in a way that he was praying also for the Mennonite church around the world, in whose place, I had engaged him in friendship, asking that this distant fellowship of friends should be deepened and empowered, defended even in its scattered life. This was such a powerful reminder to me, a memory of the nature of this friendship and partnership, which emerged in our engagement in Africa.
What people will find in this collection is largely what we asked for, which was not, please report everything you did in starting, seminars and teaching the Bible and all of that kind of stuff, but share an experience of how you were transformed in your own faith, in your ministry, or whatever, by your encounter with brothers and sisters. And I leave it that open-ended because we ask our African brothers and sisters to do the same. So this is a combination of North American Mennonites and our colleagues and friends in Africa who are reflecting on experiences, relational experiences, transformative experiences that we had. There is an introduction that sort of tells the history of Mennonite involvements and encounters with AICs and so on. But the bulk of the book is about transformational storytelling. And my own story and many of the others was similar. We were worshiping with the Sacred Cherubim and Seraphim Society, Nigerian-rooted church, but in Ivory Coast. My parents came over to visit, and we went to church there. Later on, we found out that my father had had a heart attack, and we went to church. and shared that with the community. And the leader of the church and the entire community gathered around us, laid hands on us, and prayed for my father and for us. And these were the days when you didn't have instant communication back and forth. I mean, we sent letters, but, we felt, pretty cut off from information. In fact, we found out about my father's heart attack through a church bulletin, not through any communication with the family. But the moment that was so meaningful to us was being surrounded and prayed for by our brothers and sisters in the faith. In my story about that, I say this is what brought special meaning to Jesus's words, that if you follow me, you may be leaving behind your biological mother and father and brothers and sisters, but in the kingdom, you will receive more brothers and sisters than you could have ever imagined. It was like a blazing witness to what we had been gifted with and in that moment. And that's a story that just characterizes our whole time in Ivory Coast and a lot of the stories that are recorded in this collection.
What are some lessons that you think this history has for the practice of Christian mission? What makes for mission that is authentic to Jesus?
I think it generally shows a sharing of experiences. The Mennonites had an experience to share, and the AICS also had some experience to share. And by working together, we all got a better picture of ministry and also of mission and about the ministry of Jesus Christ. I think, to me, that's one of the major lessons that I've learned from the Mennonite AIC collaboration in mission in Africa.
It was a poet I read who said this: if you're lucky, it will bring you to your knees. And that could apply to a whole range of experiences in life. I think the encounter with African independent churches at its best had this effect upon Mennonites, in the sense that this encounter reflected to us the ways in which we have become impoverished in spirituality because of the surrounding culture, because of the influence of our times. And that laying down those encumbrances in our encounter with AICs, learning what things really are extraneous and even distracting to us in the pursuit of the call to follow, is a terrific gift. If you're lucky, it will bring you to your knees. That's such a powerful place to start. And of course, the independent churches are known across Southern Africa as churches that pray. They are earnest in their prayers. They are on their knees in their worship services, Sunday by Sunday, and often, during the week at other occasions, this being an expression of their great hunger to be intimate with Christ, to know the Holy Spirit and the Scriptures, and to let their lives grow from that.
It's not as if this hasn't been practiced in Christian mission. But I think what did drive, from the Western Mennonite perspective, what did drive sort of the theology of practice was actually the belief that God is at work in Africa. Before anyone else arrives, there are churches, there is spiritual quest, and the impulse is not to go and clone people so that we would know that we had mission accomplished when people look and act like we do. but to actually believe that God is working in the culture and then ask if there's a way to walk alongside what is there by invitation to strengthen people's faith and the strength of churches so that they can be more patterned after God's kingdom purposes. In a lot of ways, this is incarnational missiology, where God comes and lives among us, eats our food, walks our streets, wears our clothes, speaks our language. Jesus models what this looks like. And when Jesus sends out the disciples, he basically says the same thing. Go into villages, receive hospitality, eat the food, sleep in their beds, seek people who are people of peace and who want to be in conversation with you. And that has so often been forgotten or abandoned as mission models. Colonization is some other aberration of the Jesus model. And whenever we can rediscover what Jesus did and commanded of his disciples, modeled for his disciples, we get the mission of God on track. And there are glimmers of that in this encounter between Mennonites and AICs. It's not a perfect story, but it's an attempt on both sides to be faithful and learn from each other. And I think can be instructive for people who are considering mission, and particularly as we become a global family. We have to get to a place where we recognize God is at work everywhere, and we all have learning to do from other people's experiences and pilgrimages in walking toward Jesus.
To tie the two things that you've just shared together, also in that sending out of the disciples from Luke 10 and Matthew 10, also Jesus says, carry no bag, no purse, no sandals, that kind of thing, which gets at Jonathan's idea of the things that we might not need that get in the way of genuine relationship taking place. I was also thinking too of Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. That was a favorite Anabaptist verse. And does that somehow play into this idea of looking at the whole world as the Lord's? And so the Lord precedes us wherever we go, in the people to whom we also come, to whom we're sent in mission, wherever we might be sent and from wherever we might be sent.
I would really like to thank the mission administrators and Mennonite Church for, with time, embracing a broader vision of how we work with the Christians around the world. We got some pushback from different people when we would report, when they found out we were not planting Mennonite churches. And yet, when we would tell stories of what God was doing and the way we were attempting to walk alongside that, generally people were very appreciative and embracing of this approach. I feel it when I go to Mennonite World Conference gatherings, when many of the people we have worked with over the years are not present because they're not Mennonites. They're not part of this particular institutional family. There's some loss there because I think the larger Anabaptist family could learn a lot by listening to these people and getting to know them. But on the other hand, we did share our understanding of what it means to follow Jesus. And many of the people we've known over the years have taught us what it looks like to be a faithful follower of Jesus in Africa. But many of them have also embraced some very serious sort of early church and Anabaptist understandings of following Jesus without carrying the name of being Mennonite. So it's been an interesting journey, but it was possible because the mission institutions saw this as a visionary approach to relating to the global church. And I think going forward, as the church in the majority of the world continues to grow, there will need to be more things like this. And maybe this can be a kind of model of what it looks like.
I consider it as a privilege to know and to work with Mennonites. Prior to my enrollment at Good News Training Institute, I had not heard of Mennonites, but coming closer to them, seeing them working hard for Christ, and also having the empathy for people who actually are in the spirit but not in the word. And they have actually helped me to understand the Bible, to understand fellowship, and also to understand what it means to be ecumenical. Students come from different denominations, including AICS, to them, using the Mennonite factor, which is part of our history. So we let them know that whatever gift that you have, it is not for only your denomination, but for all Christians. And I think that message has gone deep into the minds of the students. The Good News Theological Seminary is one of the greatest legacy of the Mennonites in Africa, and particularly among the African independent churches.
The two models we have that come from Jesus' own teaching are of sharing or being in the world as yeast and salt. Both of these imply a kind of losing of yourself in the context. They lend savor, they have their effect, but they do not insist upon sort of their own identity in that context. There is a sort of losing. It is a sort of, unless a grain of wheat fall in the soil and die, it remains alone. One African independent church person told me that when Mennonites came to work in Southern Africa, they were like sugar in the tea. They lent a certain sweetness to it, though you could not say, here's the sugar and here's the rest of the tea. That as a model is a fascinating thing to think about here, say in North America. To what extent might we reconfigure church planting, for example, with this in mind, a willingness to lose ourselves in bringing influence to bear on community, perhaps churches, but maybe more, thinking even more widely than that. And then lastly, the book is a collection of stories, which I think is significant in itself. Oral societies are powerful in their storytelling. They use image and figure and story and proverb to instill wisdom and bring about transformation in the best of those stories. It's also something which in our preaching and our teaching in the West, we might well take on as a learning from the oral societies, Christian communities elsewhere who use this medium, which the book also attempts to use.
All right. And Thomas, you still are open to having Mennonites come and work with you at Good News. If there's someone that feels called to relate to the Good News Seminary, they can get in touch with Mission Network and we can hook you up.
Oh, yes. That would be great. Yeah. Because the relationship has not ended.
No.
It hasn't ended. It is still ongoing. Yeah.
That's right. And ongoing in West Africa, ongoing in Southern Africa, just in new forms and changing characters. But we're all part of the communion of saints. So a great cloud of witnesses. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for taking this hour with me.